Ladies and gentlemen, today we are discussing very important area of Pakistan politics and every discussion. When this new government came, there was only economy which was discussed by government and opponents. So everything, सब चीज़ की तान economy पे टूट रही है. We have Dr. Sohail Jehangir Malik साहब, but I hope he will give us a different view of what is going on at the moment. The discussion paradigms are different, what we think nowadays and we hear every day, whether on television or whether from the opposition in the parliament or government in their press conferences. But here we will, look at the economy different angle and paradigm differently. So before I request Dr. Sab to give his presentation, let me briefly introduce the young researchers who are here, those who might be knowing or not. But Dr. Sab is known for his work in Pakistan and outside. And he is Pakistan's most prolific development policy analyst and scholar of Dr. Sohail Jehangir Malik, which I have already started. I have named him. I think something is going on with this here. दोनों को करना चाहिए ना. His published work in the area of poverty alleviation and agriculture and rural development strategies is widely recognized. He has been involved with the policy research on Pakistan since 1980s. His seminal work in the late 80s on estimating poverty at the agroclimate zone level in Michael Lipton and Jackson von der Gag edited World Bank and the IFRI book, including the poor presented for the first time disaggregated regional analysis to highlight why one-size-fits-all policies do not work effectively. The data, when we discuss about data and disaggregated data, that was not easily available. But now that's particularly worked on that area. There are many other areas of work. If I start that, I think I will take much time of that. Instead, we will hear from Dr. Sohail Jehangir Malik.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I hope this works. And I want to thank you all for coming, especially the young people that are sitting at the back. My constant effort is just to get the discussion going in Pakistan. And my attempt is to reach out to young people. So even if one of you, I know one of you here is listening very intently, but if you get the gist of this message, the idea is that you need to bring informed discussion to the debate. It shouldn't be opinions. It shouldn't be based on I said so or because I say so. We should try and build a culture of informed discussion and debate that basically informs decision making. And it informs decision making in both ways. It creates a body of knowledge that makes it impossible for perverse decision making to take place. And it facilitates those decisions that are necessary to be made. So I'm going to divide my discussion today into two different parts. The first part, I will look at the state of the economy, and I will present this in the form of numbers. By the way, this presentation will be available here at STPI, and each one of the tables that I've used is cited. So you can actually go and verify the information. And I urge you to actually manipulate, play with the numbers, do your own analysis so that you get a better understanding of where we are. In the teaching of social risk management, we use this template. And this template basically divides the risks that an individual faces at the micro level, at the meso level, and at the macro level, and it covers the entire possible range of risks that a human can face in a society. And unfortunately, Pakistan today is faced with each and every one of these risks. So we are beset with social risks of the highest order, and they are mounting. Even you just take the last column in terms of the macro aspects. Look at, we have a pattern of earthquakes, we have floods, drought, winds, and they form part of the natural disasters. Then you look at the health, you look at the life cycle, you look at social. We have civil strife, we have war, we have social upheaval, we have the collapse of output. You look at the economic ones, we have the balance of payments issue, we have financial crisis, technology, trade induced terms of trade shocks, etc., etc. You look at the political ones, there is a huge and recurring pattern of default on commitment, of backtracking on reform. And that is one of the huge risks at the macro level. So you can go towards the left and start looking at the micro risks that beset human life and how people are faced with each one of these. Unfortunately, our ability to manage these constraints is severely affected. As in the modern world, as we evolve, as we develop, our capacity to manage these risks should increase. And yet, in our case, we find that our capacity is diminishing. And there are a number of reasons for this. I'm talking about social risk. Social protection programs that you have, like the Benazir and these others are attempts at managing some of these risks. But why do we have this huge inability to manage risks? There is an inequitable inherent distribution of resources and power. The commodity producing sectors, like I mentioned, their share is going down, and in the process there is this transformation to the services. Now, if the services were to take place in the rural areas, this growth, then maybe you could say that there were some linkage effects driving this. But these are services that occur in the urban areas and with very little commodity production taking place. That linkage that spurs economic growth is missing. Now, these are the linkages that are missing in the debate. All the debate you hear is about managing the fiscal deficit and addressing the value of the rupee. Nobody talks about the fact that the overvalued rupee actually created a huge anti-export bias for decades, which is one of the reasons for Pakistan's low export growth, but also that the pattern of subsidies and support that was given for different industries. Assalamu alaikum, sir. I am honored that you came. That the pattern of industrialization, etc., that's taken place has not been efficiency enhancing. It has not been based on a pattern of increasing industrialization that was more efficient so that we could compete in the international markets. Now, if you look at the structure shifting to the services sector, we do not have the skills and the capacity to support the growth of services. And there is no capacity building exercise going on that basically says this is where skills enhancement is going to come from so that you can compete. Now that you've put all your eggs in the services basket, we should be competitive. There are many economists going around here saying, cities are the engines of growth, which means we have the services, but do we have the services or the skills for these cities? We don't. We have a long way to go. And there is no process that I can see where these skills are actually being built. Now, within this inadequate transformation, there is a very fascinating, if you look at the breakup of the numbers, look at the proportion of labor. 44% of your labor is sitting on agriculture, which accounts for less than 20%. If you look at the way in which these patterns have changed, agriculture share may have declined, industry's share, very small change over time. The largest change has been in the services sector, but that's not where the largest proportion of the labor is going. So the labor is not going to your fastest producing sector also. So bear that in mind as well. Not happening in the discussion. We should be integral to the discussion that's taking place in this country. Look at the sectoral breakup of services. Remember that there are 6 components in terms of how it's put together. But I want you to focus only on the fact that between 1999 and 2000 and then 17-18, wholesale and retail trade has actually almost remained constant. Trade and transport, which are the engines of growth, has actually declined the share, and it's brought up by these shares in the government and the other sectors that I spoke about. So very little. Now focusing further on the distorted patterns of trade, you know that our imports are skyrocketing and our exports have remained more or less static. If you look at the services, we have an escalating trade imbalance in services. We are importing much more services than we are exporting. So a service sector export-led growth strategy in Pakistan is meaningless without a focus on some kinds of skills. And now that we've opened up with China, remember their abundant factor is also labor. Their labor is 10 times more disciplined than ours, and they have a much more rigorous approach to these things. So we have these underlying issues, and they're all linked to the policy. Now look at the export performance. It has been abysmal. It's all low value added. These are mostly textiles and food, which is agriculture based or commodity based, and mostly at very low value addition. And it goes only to a few countries. Look at the pie charts on the right hand side. And you know what's the fascinating thing? Our exports to China have actually declined as a proportion of our total exports. These are things that do not feature in the, and with these adjustments in the rates, etc., they now have a captive market. Look at our imports. They're highly inelastic, few commodities, few countries, and look at the right hand side. The share of imports from China has increased substantially in the last few years. And these are imports that would compete with industries that we would have found here because they're at the lower ends. On the export side, I also wanted to say that within our major structure of exports, there is a very high import content. So we are actually importing, labeling, branding, and then exporting. So it's not adding anything to the value added here. You all know about the structures of the budgets, and I'm not going to go into this, but remember there are a few historic facts. The actuals always differ from the budgeted. Invariably, historically, the growth targets are always missed, revenue targets are always missed, expenditure is always more than what is budgeted. Current expenditure is always significantly higher than capital expenditure, and it is always exceeded in every budget. This is part of the pattern. The development budget to GDP ratio is always low, and it has been declining, and when cuts are made, they are made to the development budget. So where are the growth prospects? So this poor resource mobilization, huge issues. It's an endemic corruption problem, it's a management and capacity problem. There are weaknesses in the tax system that have been identified since the 1990s, have not been addressed. This narrow tax base has now become a joke. And you know, the debate now is not to broaden the tax base but to deepen it, because it cannot be broadened, which is very interesting. There are preferential tax treatments for sectors and for individuals. There is a higher incidence of taxation on the key productive sectors and on those segments of society that would really be able to contribute. There's a huge role of lobbies in this setting up. And then there is this undocumented economy, which many now believe should not be undocumented, since everybody has a national ID card and it's all computerized. If you look at the budgets, you realize the fixity of our situation. And the problem is that we are stuck with interest payments, defense, subsidies, and grants. And that proportion, so there is very little leeway in terms of what you can actually do. And that structure has not actually changed over time. In fact, what's going to happen now is that your interest payments are going to go up because of the fact that your rupee is being revalued. Public debt has been a huge issue, and our attempts to address it have been also very, very novel. On the right-hand side, you see the public debt as a proportion of GDP. You see those huge dips? They're not caused by a decline in our debt. They're caused by changes in the way in which we define those debt, by shifting entire portions of a pension fund into some holding account, or by expanding the GDP, rebasing it in ways that also led to that drastic decline in tax to GDP ratio. All done by the same brilliant man who also moved the entire distribution of poor households to the median value to show that poverty did not exist in Pakistan. In the process, didn't realize that all those households were rural Sindh. So rural Sindh suddenly had this huge improvement in poverty done by the wizardry of one man who would almost became Minister for Poverty 2 weeks ago. So it is all possible in Pakistan. The numbers are all fudged. If you look at the GDP numbers, and I'm only going to show you, and I want the young people here to realize, you must triangulate the data. When you get it, compare from 2-3 different sources, see if it makes sense. And these are the GDP growth accounts from the economic survey, and I'm going to highlight only 2015-16. In that year, agriculture, the first announcement, agriculture was minus 1.16. But then they corrected it and it became 0.15. And the main crops were negative 5.86. And because of that, cotton ginning, which is now a separate category, was minus 22. So all of this makes sense. But then, if all of this was happening, go down to the industrial sector and look across. How did industry grow at 5.69%? It uses the raw material from agriculture, and it uses electricity from a system that did not have any electricity for 18 out of the 24 hours, and yet industry was 5.6. But that is not all of it. The numbers had to be balanced and upgraded, so the wizard there said do something. Forestry grew at 14.31% in 2001 year. Okay, and so if you want to attribute this to Imran Khan and his tsunami, you can't, because in the GDP these are timber and non-timber forest products, not the number of trees he planted. And if that was so, what happened in the subsequent year, or what happened in the year before? This is a constant thing. You can go down and see when we made a lot of noise about this, the next year fisheries suddenly out of the blue went up. So every time you see a strange number, please question it, and question very, very, and then look at across where it's absorbed, where it comes from, and try and see how it's balanced. So this is just one example. So you have very, very poor numbers. You have a constant attempt to balance these scenarios on the books with no relationship to the actual production, the commodity producing sectors and the productive capacity of this country. And that is where the biggest problem lies, and that is where the debate should be. And that is my need to keep talking to people, that we need growth, and we don't need growth of the type that happens in Karachi or in Lahore. We need inclusive growth that includes the poor, and those poor are the ones that are spread in the remote corners of this country that have no and for many of you it is very simple. Do a budget given current prices and a realistic probability based interpretation of what a daily wage in Pakistan would be. If somebody tells you it is 1,000 rupees per day or whatever high number, please multiply that by the probability that this person gets that job every day for that month. And you will find that most daily labor you talk to, it depends on where they are located. In the smaller cities, that coefficient is 0.5 or less. So they're getting half of the stated wage, and then you try and look at what it costs to feed a family of 6, and you will be horrified at the reality of our situation. I have a house in a small village near here, and it's linked to Wa and Hassan Abdal, only 6-7 miles away, and yet for most of those households, if somebody is sick in the household, the decision is between the type of food they eat that day or medicine for the poor person. So these have to be kept in mind. Now, the incidence of poverty and the distribution, it's across its size and regions, etc., again has been severely manipulated, and I won't go into the details. That I have published papers on it, and we can talk about it. But even if we accept their numbers, these aggregates hide vast disparities. So you have an aggregate number of 36% poor. That means there are some portions where 60-70% are poor. And in the case of the bulk of the rural sector, the poverty resides with the non-farm sector and with the smallest size categories of farm, and these are predominantly poor. So they cannot take the risks that are associated with the adoption of new technologies and with the... So we have a moral and ethical obligation to look at poverty and to look at development from this lens. This is also in terms of the strength of our society and what we are leaving for our children, extremely important. And then from economic purposes, the low propensity to save means that they have nothing to invest and they have very little ability to take risks, etc. So you should be fixed on poverty. I'm just going to show these two lines. They come from the Planning Commission's website. After years of fighting with them, they were showing the green line, which is the lower one, and according to them in 2013-14, poverty in Pakistan would have been 6%. So when we started crying and we said even in the United States it is higher than this, they did a rebasing. So they spent a lot of money and a lot of hoopla, and they readjusted the numbers. So they readjusted the 2013-14 to go up to about 30-some%. But then they did this brilliant next step, which only Pakistanis can do, because they had to show a declining trend in poverty. So they said, we are backcasting. So they backcasted the poverty numbers, which is the red numbers I am showing you, and this is on their website. It showed that when and by the way, this was done in the Nawaz Sharif regime by Mr. Iqbal, the minister, that when his government actually left and Musharraf took over, poverty was in the 60% level. And he actually started bringing it down, if their numbers are to be believed. So I actually sent him an email. I said, if your boss sees this, you are in trouble. But it was on their website. And there are many other such self-contradictions that happen. These poverty numbers have behind them a whole theory and history. But the important thing is, whatever number you take, you have to understand that that number masks a huge variation, and it's that variation which you have to address. So basically, I'm going to present you just for the agriculture and the rural sector some numbers very quickly, and this is according to our estimates, 62% of the population in the non-farm category were poor in Pakistan. And if you start looking at it in the less than 3 acre category, about 62.6%, and then it goes to 42.6 and 44 and it starts declining till you get to about the 25 acre and above, and then it starts to stabilize. So even in those categories, because it varies by agroclimatic zone and it varies by size of farm, and The sources of income in each one of these categories also is different. Crop income might be a much larger share in one particular zone, whereas it is wages and salaries in another, and it is remittance income in another. If you don't take these disparities into account, you cannot build an adequate model of growth, etc., if you don't understand these underlying dynamics. So, and then these sources also change by size of farm. So you need a differentiated agriculture strategy to start with if you want them to take risks, etc., in terms of. So several reasons why Pakistan's agriculture is the only way out. The primary one is it feeds into your industry, it defines the commodity producing structure of this economy. You don't have the skills to have a competitive service sector at this stage, and you have to start doing things to address it. But in the meantime, the predominance of our population is based in the rural areas, and that's where agriculture is. It's also critically linked to food security, and I won't go into that debate. This place is the center of discussion and debate on food security, and I thought that would be all right. So, understanding some of the basic constraints of Pakistan's agriculture is very important in terms of defining some of these spaces, and most people do not understand how it has changed. So let's look at some of these constraints. The number of small farms in Pakistan is almost quadrupled. In 1960, only about 19% of the farms were in the smallest size category. In the last agriculture census, 64.7% were in that small size category. So predominantly small size farms. And
this is even nearly a decade old.
Yes, so it's further subdivision plus huge variation across regions that I've been talking about. And we haven't gotten into other aspects in terms of land degradation and poor quality and etc. But fragmentation is one of the things people have not understood. If you look at the smallest size categories of farm, the average number of fragments is 3. So even if he has 5 acres or 3 acres, it's divided into 3 fragments. Each of them is a postage size stamp somewhere. So you can't even have efficient movement, and unless you realize this, you can design all the policies. They will basically favor the largest size categories, and that's what's been happening. There has been a huge and continuous process of policy feeding the highest. So in terms of these numbers, the second thing that's been happening is very little diversification of agriculture. Agriculture is basically 5 crops. It's basically 5 crops with very little diversification. In the 1960s, and this is across the board, in the 1960s, grains accounted for about between 1990 and 2010. If you look at the less than 5 hectares, 70% of their. And if you look at the 20 hectares and above, even there it is 50 and above 50%. It's just grains. Now, they are not the highest value added for that particular land. But why are we forced into that pattern? There is a continuous policy thrust that has forced us in that direction. Second, and many of you may not realize this, atta, wheat, provides the cheapest source of calories per rupee. So for the poor person who has to take in the calories, wheat then becomes the answer. It might not be, although food security means availability and accessibility and utilization, we only focus on that one aspect. We don't focus on the fact that it's so the other thing is our yields have been way below the potential, and this is historically through huge gaps. Part of it because we don't understand our agriculture, and we don't understand the fact that the smallest guys cannot take the risks and cannot put in the inputs. But we also don't understand the fact that he is not literate, and The extension service has collapsed completely. In the Punjab, there is one agriculture officer for 70,000 of these people. One. And he's supposed to provide advice on everything to everybody. He's not a specialist in this day and age. So he spends most of his time focused on a few so-called model farmers which he selects, and these are the ones that he takes for visits, all the big people, and the rest of his time he spends trying to fill the public rallies that these political parties have, because that then becomes his secondary job, or looking after the government functionaries. So this agriculture, it basically exists within the rural non-farm economy, and we have several surveys and they highlight some of the characteristics of this rural. Very important to understand if you're going to start thinking out of the box. One, that our rural economy is predominantly small size enterprises. So there's lack of collateral, there's high moral hazard because of the size. They're predominantly sole proprietorship. They don't form partnerships because of the lack of contract enforcement and because of other malfeasance. They're unregistered and they are standalone. And they are geographically limited. They have very small forward and backward linkages because they don't have the abilities to go beyond them. Very primitive business practices. And I have the numbers we've been doing surveys for years now. There's a lack of standards and quality, both of which are determinants of value addition in agriculture and in the rural economy. That doesn't exist. There is very limited information flow, and this information asymmetry is the cause of huge profits. And I will show you just now price differentials from the same day from different markets for different commodities in this day and age when it is so easy to move produce from one place to another. So there is this low human capital formation, so you can't access market information, and these limited linkages I spoke about. Access to finance is a huge issue. Bigger issue is contracts and enforcements. I am so scared if I get into a contract, if it is not honored, I have no way of getting my money back from them. So we need all of this, and what I wanted to show you was that we have a age structure, a pyramid where predominantly our population is young people, and these young people are now hopeless. Previously they would get government jobs through some uncle or some relative or somebody. Those are dried up now. So, and these people are and they have no role models to start with, but they also have no hope. And what they see is people that can loot and plunder, so they become the role models. And in that process, there is no ummeed. So my dream is to kickstart a process of inclusive growth that includes the neglected segments, the sectors and regions, but it does it in a way that provides hope and is instantly visible to people, so that some of the ethical issues that I spoke about in society also get addressed. When people find out that they can actually get an honest and decent living and not be exploited, then it can lead to that. So we need to provide gainful livelihoods to these people, and that is the imperative. You can balance your books as much as you want. Remember, for monetary policy, I want to tell you and for all economic policy, there is a time lag. What's happening now is the result of monetary policy a year ago. You're going to continue to feel these effects even if you were to transform completely. No governor of the state bank can do anything about it. And it's going to get more and more painful. So you need to have more visible, obvious signs of economic activity at the grassroots level that can help in this process. And for that, we need to take advantage of these production linkages. I mentioned that they are very, very limited. We need to take advantage of the consumption linkages because we have this population and there is a consumption, like I said, it's a consumption driven. The labor market linkages, labor is immobile and there's a reason for it. The cost of moving because of the information asymmetry, etc. there is a huge shortage, for example, of domestic help in Islamabad. Female domestic help, maids, babysitters, etc. There might be an oversupply in Sargodha, but those children, those young girls or women have no ability to move to Islamabad. They don't know who to contact unless there's a relative. They have nowhere to stay. There is no organized system that tells them that they are protected and they are part of a system. This is just services. I can talk to you about other services, plumbing, household maintenance, hundreds of them, and the price differences are mind-boggling, and there is data analysis done already that identifies a whole range of these activities, etc. There are investment linkages to be made also. There is money available in certain parts of where people do not know where to invest safely, and where they are guaranteed a return because of the lack of contract, etc. Then these spatial linkages that I spoke about can also be leveraged in terms of several different things that can be done. So the system, it needs to provide, to start with, you need confidence and self-respect for these young people that are part of this demographic bulge. It needs to include these sectors, and it needs to start very quickly showing demonstrable impact. If it doesn't, then that hope gets further lost and the price escalation is killing. I teach a class of economics from Washington to 19 different universities in Pakistan at the same time. These young people log on and we communicate one-on-one. This is a workable example, and I show this to you because this is the basis of what I'm trying to propose. And what I'm trying to propose is that we have a young entrepreneurs, educated entrepreneurs program that should use the network of IT that's already exists in these district universities. Every district college is now a university, and it has IT facilities. It has a director, Orac, by the way. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the university, whose job it is to develop these things, but he is looking at high-end .com activities, whereas what this country needs is not unicorns. It needs to have these workhorses in place, and it needs to have millions of these workhorses very quickly. So we need to organize these groups, provide them with very, very minimal skills, but communication, get their loans underwritten. There are resources available within the system that can actually act as guarantees. You know, the World Bank has a MEGA. It goes around offering multilateral, it offers guarantees to, we need to set up our own MEGA, where banks are encouraged to lend to these groups based on defensible business plans for niche product skills and activities from these regions that can be traded across these different groups against these guarantees that this central system should provide. They should not be given a dole. It's not necessary. They will pay for these services because there is enough in the system to do this. And we need to make social responsibility an essential element of this system. They should either adopt one BHU or one school or one other aspect of their own civic surrounding, and these young people should become the monitors of change. And they participate in this system only if they are carrying on their CSR responsibility, otherwise they are out of the system. Now, if you set up this incubator and you have only 10 such groups of 10 people, and this is the simplest example, employing 10 people in their surrounding, you are looking at over 100,000 jobs in one go. And the multiplier effects are enormous. So this is where you can address the unemployment problem of Pakistan. So the mechanism basically is that you need to get the HEC and the PPAFs and these other agencies together. This system should be run on a platform of social entrepreneurship, with no exploitative large-scale financial interests coming into the process. They should be able to interact and grow from their own strength, and to be able to do this in all the areas. There can be a competitive selection of projects, etc., based on proposals that are submitted. The training can come very easily. The State Bank can mandate commercial banks to lend. It is already part of their mandate to lend for rural finance and for agriculture, and what I've seen in Punjab in my last assignment was horrific. The bulk of agriculture credit from commercial banks in Punjab went to 5 districts, and for non-farm, which is where the value addition takes place, to only 2 districts. 90% of their credit in 2016-17 went to Rawalpindi district and Lahore. I'm going to give you some examples of the potential gains from such a system. One, in terms of just the agriculture, shifting the production possibility frontier upwards with capacity as its basic axis. You notice that the largest gap is what I call the extension gap. You can make this huge shift in the production possibility simply by being able to provide the knowledge and the information to the small farmer where he is present, and for that you need these interlocutors, because he doesn't understand the gadgets. You know, the Punjab government was going to give everybody an intelligent phone and was going to link it to a service, advisory service, etc. But you need the next step. You need somebody that can represent them. We have, my company and I have analyzed a large number of programs over the past 15 years that dealt with income transfer programs, cash transfer programs to the poorest, etc. The equivalent of Imran Khan's 4 hens and a cock, 4 murgiyan और 1 मुर्गे वाला जो example है. The problem is that the people that you give it to do not have the skills to grow, and in most cases in the other programs we looked at DFID financed income transfer programs for women, etc. The marketing stage they got totally robbed and they had no way of accessing. So you need these educated young men and women that should come from those villages, so they have the Grameen roots, but they also have the linkages to the people like Majid and yourself and others that provide the connections. That is the only way and the quickest way possible right now. Otherwise, if you go back and look at let me give you some more examples and we will come back to this discussion. These are price differences taken. The government of Punjab records district level prices, and this is their data for different prices for wheat, rice and some fruits, etc. On any given month, the percentage difference, even in wheat, which is a fixed price commodity, was 4 to 6%. In rice, it went from 12% to 21%. So if there is a group in Narowal or in Shekhupura and there is a group in Rawalpindi, there is a 21% profit to be made on any given day in that month by these young people. And the turnaround is so quick. It is very easy now to transport large commodity, so long as you know who's receiving it. There is that confidence and the linkages work, and there is no large out. It gets much higher when you get into, this is maize and bajra, cotton. Look at potatoes, the right hand side. Look at onions, look at tomato. These are more perishable things. Mango, citrus, huge margins, okay? And I'm talking about traditional things. We can get into others. If you shift that production possibility frontier, like I said, just the potential gains from the major crops was 607 billion, according to this very simple arithmetic example. Now, existing research tells us that in the crop sector, on the input side, there are huge possibilities in production technology, crops, seeds, pesticides, fertilizer, services. On the output side, creating bulk for market. The producer is very small. In every village, if you can create a system where there is an aggregating function taking place, you already added value. You teach them how to sort, grade and pack. You've created an additional level of value, etc. So similarly with processing, most of our, you will be horrified with the post-harvest losses. 40% of value is lost at the post-harvest level in fruits. 40%. 9% in grains. You know, you leave behind so much grain and those other value added straw and other things that are not processed. So, by the way, I'm basing this on studies that have already been done, so the details are available. On livestock also, huge potential in and demonstrated. Somebody asked me, why don't cooperatives work? Well, cooperatives for livestock and dairy were working very, very well. There was one group set up by, it was led by Zafar Altaf, and he was actually sent to court because the competing powerful vested interests could not tolerate the fact that 80,000 women were members of that cooperative. And we have detailed analysis. I did an evaluation of the 3 or 4 what I thought were the big money earners at that stage. Their potential value addition was incredible with no huge investments, etc. But $500 million had to be given as subsidy to a particular group so that everything then went asunder, and that particular his entire effort went to drain. For each of these districts that I am showing you now, there was a project that was supervised by a man I didn't know was coming here today, so iski publicity ho rahi hai mufat mein. They identified, it was called the Empowering Firms program. They identified niche products in 10 different, we identified for them as consultants, but every district, full studies done of these niche activities and products. These are very, very small scale. By the way, the bulk of the money for that program eventually went to financing mangoes in Multan, which was the constituency of a prime minister at that time. You look at these, each one of these has such a huge potential, and the studies that can show, I showed you 20-30% margins that are significantly higher than this with very detailed studies. So basically it's an attempt to bring connectivity, it's an attempt to show that you can develop these incubators and they don't need to be high-end incubators, and that financial mechanisms that are innovative are possible. There are very interesting people that are actually working in this area now that are looking at trying to get commercial banks interested in funding this, to be able to link these demand and supply disconnects and to build quality assurance and business confidence, which is the driving force. So if we have this initiative, all of those things work, plus we can build in monitoring and evaluation, which is the biggest missing element in development in Pakistan. We don't know what to replicate and we don't know what to upscale because we've never done that analysis. So the recommendations on an aggregate are one size fits all does not work. You need to introduce context specific out of the box strategies. You need to think out of the box. You need to put people in the middle and you need to connect them. And you need to campaign to make agriculture and these commodity producing sectors and rural activity as the vehicle for, otherwise they will all move to the grand route that we are establishing, and nobody has actually done or should have done, and I made a presentation on this at this Center of Excellence for CPEC 2 days ago. There is no social impact analysis of the China corridor. And you can start talking about those other bigger aspects later, but when you have such an enormous change in the traffic and transport, there are huge, both positive and negative, and societal. So you need an environmental, social, poverty impact analysis to be done as quickly as possible. So that's basically it. With all of these come these other elements, which should be important elements of any program. And once we start linking this to incentives and demonstrating that honorable livelihoods are possible, I think the ethical deterioration will address itself, and the skills will become demand driven. Right now there are 17 institutions, I was told by the Honorable Minister, imparting skills in this country, but they're all supply driven. Where is the linkage to the niche areas? So we should forget about what the state can do for us. Let's tell the state what we can do for it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm speaking to groups like yours. If we can get like-minded people together and we can link them to these 19 universities that I've told you about, there are 140 or some such institutions of higher learning that can become the centers. Each one of them is mandated to have an Orac. So the Orac is the incubator, the guy that's supposed to develop business. So thank you very much, Abid.